The case came to JRT like a lot of our other cases, by dropping from an air conditioning vent directly into my lunch. Lot of eat. I just paid for that! I yelled out, seeing the manila folder bound in string dropped onto my flatbread and steamed eggs. I picked up the folder, wiping off the breadcrumbs and the egg from the folder, while the cashier working in the cafeteria laughed it off. Well, in that case, we'll just comp you your meal and get you a fresh one, but I think you should get that to Mike, the cashier whose name tag listed her as Heinous, said as my coins were put into the register and my tray was taken away. Am I going to get my money back until I get back here? I asked Heinous, who only shrugged. I'm sorry, but the process of reimbursement takes approximately 4 to 5 business months. 45 months? I clarified while Heinous giggled. No, that would be ridiculous. It's for 5 months. Why would it take 425 months to get a 5 centi reimbursement? Why do you think I said two instead of two? You said two twice. That's why I think you said two to me. Okay, what were we talking about? My refund, because a manila folder dropped from the AC into my food. Oh, yes. I'm afraid a refund cannot be processed by the register. A refund has to be processed through the franchise owner, and then they will investigate whether or not a refund is allowed. And then a check will be written with a 5 centi responsibility for the postage deducted from the check, Canis said with a broad smile. So, in other words, I have to send in a form, wait up to 150 days for a refund check through the mail, and even if it is decided that I am owed a refund and they will still deduct 5 centi for the postage, which is exactly the same amount as is spent on the food. So my choices are either fight this and get nothing, or do nothing and save time. Well, not quite. You're thinking of 4 to 5 calendar months. This is 4 to 5 business months. It's like a regular month, except it doesn't count months that have imperial holidays or weekends in it. Isn't that all of the months? Well, not Libiary. Great. I guess I should start packing a lunch, I said as I turned away from Canis to make my way back to Mike's office. I ignored my growling stomach as I knocked on his door. He was the head of the entire floor I worked on. I wasn't sure about his role exactly, but I knew he was a junior partner working directly with Jade, Rakuel, and Themis of the Jade, Rakuel, and Themis law firm. When I made it to Mike's office, I double-checked the nameplate to make sure that it is the correct office. Sometimes the partners' offices changed into something else. Whenever they changed, they couldn't get the name just right. Sometimes it would be in a script no one could really read, but sort of looked like the name, or the name would be something else entirely. Occasionally they got clever and were off by just a single letter, so it was important to know who you were speaking to. But yeah, the nameplate was correct. Mike A.L., and I knocked on the door just for him to call me in, and I opened the door to see Mike at his desk. Mike was dressed smartly in a comfortable-looking black suit with a bright orange tie. Next to his desk was a white cane that he could easily grasp when he left the office. The window's blinds were open, letting in the beautiful Swamp City sunlight. The lights above were all off. He had a pair of large black sunglasses set on his desk in a clear protective case, while he himself wore a white blindfold. Unlike the rest of his smart outfit, this blindfold was old, a little torn, and it was heavily stained with brown-red stains. And even as he spoke to me, I could see thin trails of blood beat up out from underneath his blindfold, which he occasionally touched up with tissues kept on his desk. I don't know why his eyes bled while at work. It never happened when I saw him outside of the office. Maybe it had something to do with his blindfold? I never understood people who did things that hurt them while they were on the job. In my opinion, if you had to hurt yourself to do your job, you were doing the job wrong. But then again, I was just an assistant and Mike was a junior partner, so what did I know? Welcome, Kel Hoj. What new case are you bringing to me? He asked as I put the folder in front of him as he removed the string and opened the folder as he pressed his fingers on the braille on the hard stock paper. He read it over while his face looked forward and he spoke to me. Her lunch cut short again? Yeah, again. Why don't they just leave it in my inbox so my lunch isn't interrupted every time someone wants her help? Mike sighed as he flipped the paper over and read over the next one. Hell, they need your help when they need your help. Usually that's during lunch. Even if we moved your lunch, they would still follow you. Once I read this over, you can head back to lunch and take your lunch hour. Yeah, I wish the cashier had already taken my lunch money. And the process of getting a refund is essentially impossible, I told Mike, who removed his hands from the paper. And this was at our cafeteria, he asked, and I nodded before I just said it out loud. Yes, it is. Now listen closely, Kel. I need you to contact security and send them over to the cafeteria. Why? We don't have a cashier in the cafeteria. All of the food and drinks are gratis. Really? I've been paying for lunch every day for the last 2 years. No one told me it was gratis. I told him as I turned to leave the office. Ah, Tavit, why does no one tell me anything? Mike said as he kept running his fingers across the raised dots that made up the legal document. I made it back to my desk and I called security, who was sent over the cafeteria. After 20 minutes, they left the cafeteria confused because they found nobody in that cafeteria. I sighed as I made my way back to the cafeteria, grabbing another flatbread and steamed eggs as I made my way out of the cafeteria, while the janitor was busy putting up a plaque in front of the entrance of the cafeteria. All food is free, do not pay anyone for it, it said as I made my way to the desk to read over some of the employment contract laws. Most employment in the 7 cities works by paying during payday for work done leading up to that day. But from city to city, exact details varied. For example, in Swamp City, payment either had to be made via check or coin during payday, while in Eden City, payment had to be made within 3 business days of payday. So a lot of higher paying jobs paid early, while a lot of lower income jobs paid it 3 business days after payday, often to the great discomfort of their workers. Then there were specifics of pay in advance versus arrears pay. A few jobs were required to pay people in advance before the job began, usually mercenary work, some artist jobs, and a few others. However, if they don't do the job that is required after being paid, there are usually pretty severe consequences. Most people get paid in arrears. They do a job and then get paid after the job is done, usually on payday, but there were a few contract jobs that paid in a lump sum once the job was completely over. The military was a great example of that. Pellets and auxiliaries were only paid after their years of service were done. The reasoning was simple. If they died on the job, then no money was owed at all. Great money saver for the imperial government. Other contracts, such as working on boats, were also done with the intent of having people work the entire contract before getting payment. Those contracts usually had a clause that explained that if they quit the job before it was finished, that no money was owed at the end. In my opinion, it felt predatory and like a trap. But that was why I was learning, so I could help others as well. Understanding what was, or wasn't, legal would help those who had disputes with their employers. Wage theft is still the largest form of theft in the empire of the 7 cities. People not realizing that working through their lunch, skipping breaks to catch up, or having minutes rounded down, all adding up to their loss. As I was learning about contract laws, I got a message from Mike. He wanted me to help out Emily with this case. I quickly skimmed over the details of the case. It actually related to the contract laws I was talking about, but in a more esoteric way. There was an employee who had a 10-year long contract with his employer, Callister Construction. He was a construction worker who signed up to work for 10 years in exchange for room and board, constructing the high-speed rail connecting Swamp City and River City, before getting a lump sum of 500,000 centi at the end of his contract. Apparently, he had been working 14-hour-long days, and 3 years into his contract, he died on the job. However, due to the nature of the contract, just because he was dead, it didn't count as termination of the contract. Now his body continued working on the rail line while his spirit was inside, unable to live and unable to move on. With his death, he was now working 24-hour-long shifts, not allowed to rest even as his body decays, and now he's reaching out to us for assistance. Apparently, while we were going to build a case with him, the judge had filed a preliminary injunction. So, until we presented our case in 2 months, the client was not compelled to work at all. However, if the judge found that he did owe the 10 years to his employer, then the missed time would be added to his service. If he was found to be at fault, there may be a chance for Callister Construction to get even more additional time added to his contract. I gathered up my things as I headed over to Emily's office. I knocked on the door only for her to let me in. Emily was a few years older than I was, and she was focused a lot on employment laws. And in the office, we began to discuss what we were planning. Emily somehow already had the client's employment contract as she read it over, and on her desk was a single candle that burned as she spoke. So, Henry, our client might actually have a few things we can use to help him, but be sure to introduce yourself, she said as she gestured to the candle. I waved at the candle and introduced myself. Hello, I'm Kel Hoj, I said to the white flame burning on the top of the black candlestick. No noise was made, but satisfied, I sat across from Emily as she handed me a copy of the contract, so I could look over it, highlighting what I could or couldn't find. I would be doing the background research while Emily focused on the actual case and the laws associated with it. Lawyers usually had whole teams of people doing research, and I was just one of Emily's people doing the research. I took the forms back to my desk as I read over the contract, looking for what Callister Construction defined as room and board, and what work hours were expected. And of course, the termination clause. Most companies terminated employment when an employee's life ended. Very few actually continued employment past death, unless you are a movie star or musician. So the laws of the 7 cities were not updated yet to include what is or isn't legal. Sure enough, in the termination clause, there was a single sentence. In the event of employee's death, it is the employee's responsibility to continue their employment until such time as the contract is fulfilled or the employer terminates employment. So the contract really did have a line saying that death didn't mean the end of a job. But there was something I needed to define. The work conditions. Undead workers were popular in the Tano Sea and in some other countries, since the dead don't need to live to work, and they could do dangerous things that the living couldn't dream of. However, in the 7 cities, the dead were still protected by the same labor laws as everyone else. Again, without the laws updating quickly, it would actually work in our favor this way. There's no legal difference between a living worker and a dead worker. That information highlighted and sent off to Emily, I went over a few more interesting parts of his contract. It defined a workday as being 8 hours long with an hour-long paid lunch, Overtime wasn't supposed to be requested because they weren't getting paid for it. And also, interestingly, room and board was defined as 3 meals per day and a personal room with a functional bed and bathroom facilities. I continued this as we collected our information, and the 2 months before the case seemed to breeze by so quickly. During the actual court hearing, I was allowed to tag along to be in the audience while Emily was there with the client. He slumped in the chair next to her. He was clearly dead, but his body still moved, a very sharp contrast to her opponent. Two very suave men in sharp suits who looked lively as they both discussed their cases to the judge and the jury. Not all civil cases have juries, but Swamp City was the exception that had juries for both civil and criminal cases. The lawyer representing Callister Construction spoke first. Esteemed members of the jury, Callister Construction is a small business. We aren't one of the large corporations who have billions to spend on their big projects. So when we have a job, we have to make sure it's done, or else we cannot make money. Reliable work is difficult to find. So when work agrees to work for us, they need to be working for us until their contract is done. If we let go of all of our employees before their contract is finished, nothing would get done, and then the high-speed rail would not be possible, which Swamp City definitely needs, the defense said, as Emily stood up and made her opening statement. Ah, yes, you say that you need your contracts to get your job done. And yet, at the same time, you cannot honor your own contracts. Before today is done, I will prove to everyone here that not only is your contract unfair, but that you don't even honor your own contracts, she said simply, and she sat to the subtle gasps to the audience and jury. She played an intense game, but I was certain of her victory. First piece of evidence is your contract itself and the invoice for Mr. Hank's first week. Your contract clearly states that the workday is not to exceed 8 hours of work with a 1 hour long lunch. Is that correct? Emily said. The defense nodded. That's a common part of our contract, yes. And yet the invoice for Mr. Hank's first week showed that he worked 14 hours each day. Is that correct? Well, yes, but that isn't our fault. Sometimes there's a lot of work that has to be done, so sometimes workers will work a bit longer to complete them. It isn't our fault that they work later. The contract clearly states that any overtime is unpaid. Ah, yes, it does. But I have here, from Mr. Hank's foreman, he was written up on his very first day. Do you know why, Mr. Callister? I have thousands of employees. I cannot keep track of all of them, Emily. Then I will read it for you. His foreman tried to write at Mr. Hank for trying to leave after the 8th hour. There was no response from your office to try and correct him or even say that wasn't right. So implicitly, your office was going to keep Mr. Hank working for an extra 6 hours every day without additional pay. That wasn't our fault. He knew that overtime was unpaid. Uh-huh. Which leads me to my next part. During the day of Mr. Hank's death, were you aware of the fact he was complaining about chest pains? Well, so what? People get sore muscles all the time. So, Mr. Hank had chest pains. The nurse on site wrote to his foreman that Hank was having a heart attack and needed to be taken away by the vanguard. Yet the foreman kept him working for an additional 6 hours, only for Mr. Hank to die at the 3rd hour. Were you aware of this fact? Well, it wasn't my fault the foreman didn't let him go. Really? So why was Hank moved into a 24-hour shift? Can you answer that? There was a shift in the courthouse. Mr. Callister didn't notice. He was still staring down at the papers in front of him, bored. The jury were all little more than shades, with masks that resembled the mirror masks of angels. However, instead of being silver, they were gold. I could see all of us reflected upside down in the masks. And the judge was also a shade as well, except instead of a mask, there was only darkness under a dark gray hood. That was the truth, just beyond the veil, or close enough to the truth beyond the veil. While Mr. Callister and his lawyer only saw the judge and jury as normal people, something twisted in the air as Mr. Callister finally tried to lie, and then found that he was not able to lie. I had him work 24 hours a day because I knew that I could get away with it, Mr. Callister said, no longer looking bored. He tried to yell or recant his statement, but he found himself unable to do so. His lawyer didn't notice as Emily asked her next question. Are you aware of the fact that it is illegal to make anyone work 24 hours a day? Emily asked as her glamour slipped a little, and you could see that her pale skin was covered in tattoos of gold and silver, and that her eyes were jet black with a wide smile on 3 mouths, 1 on her face and 2 on her neck. When her glamour returned, she was not wearing a smile when Mr. Callister answered her question. Yes. So did you willingly work Mr. Frank to death so he would be obligated to work for you? Mr. Callister is squirming hard now, not able to leave his chair, and every eye in the glamour was staring at him, and underneath the glamour only 3 pairs of eyes were looking at him. 1 pair was dead, but full of anger. Yes? Mr. Callister, you violated your own contract. You brought harm and death upon your coworker. Is there anything else you're hiding? Emily asked, and Mr. Callister tried to cover his mouth with his hands, but even while covering his mouth, his voice echoed through the room. I was going to refuse to pay Frank. The dead don't need money. His voice echoed through the court. The judge finally spoke for the first and final time. Frank's contract with Callister Construction will be terminated. He will pass on to judgment to be tried. Mr. Callister will pay his contracted amount to Frank's beneficiary, along with a 200% fine for the time Frank worked 24-hour shifts. Any similar contracts are now terminated with similar payouts to all employees, both living and dead. And for the final punishment, Mr. Callister shall spend 5 seconds in pandemonium. The judge said as Callister sat still for 5 seconds before he started screaming, and he fell out of his chair. His lawyer finally became aware of what was going on and tried to check on his client. Emily quietly put her papers away, along with Frank and I, and we all made it outside. Mr. Callister and his lawyer got here a different way from us, so they would see something different from what we saw when we went outside. Outside, we stood on the steps of the mausoleum, a very large stone structure with steps that extended hundreds of meters into the air, and yet was also as short as a single step. The columns above supported the roof that was so high up that it extended beyond the clouds, but you could still see constellations painted into the ceiling far above, and at the foot of the steps were 2 docks. Water below was as dark as midnight and as deep as eternity. What lived there didn't truly live, and it didn't truly die. One dock had a ferryman in a dark cloak, and when he moved, you could hear the jingle of coins in his hidden pockets. Frank turned to the ferryman and then to Emily as he hugged her and whispered for the first time, "Thank you," he hissed as she finally let him go, and Emily handed him 2 coins. "Give these to the ferryman, and as for us, we have our own boat," she said as he made his way to the ferryman. He took his coins and pushed his boat forward with a long pole in the water as the boat drifted further to the west into the darkness of the sunless lands. "I've never been to the mausoleum before. This was an interesting experience," he told Emily as she turned to me. "Why did you even come here?" she asked me, clearly exasperated. "I was asked to provide company," I told her as she shook her head, and we stepped onto our own boat. She gave the identical ferryman 4 coins, and he pushed our boat east, where we could see the sunset in front of us as we made our way back to the land of the living.